The wind rose before dawn and carried the smell of dust and iron across the flats. And in that thin blue hour, a lone figure stood by a fence line and counted distant hooves. The pasture looked like a gray sea, and the fences were ribs of a broken whale, and the sky was pale enough to show the lantern glow in the kitchen window. Inside, a kettle hissed and a clock ticked like a small heart. Outside, the world held its breath. The rider knew the sound. Not a herd, not freight, not a patrol, a pack. The homestead crouched low against the land. Boards were patched, shingles nailed tight, tools stacked with a care that belonged to people who could not afford to lose anything. Behind the house, a dugout was covered with brush and earth, and beneath that cover lay 2 sleeping children, and a bundle of water and bread and a small tin box with a hair ribbon in it. The one who kept watch did not look back. Counting was a way of steadying the mind, counting, and the old habit of watching how dust lifts and falls when many hooves hit hardpan at once. The rider counted again and knew the day would be long. The first light showed the track across the flats, a faint scar that ran toward the town and then away into country that ate men whole. In that light, the homestead looked smaller than truth, and the rider smaller than the homestead, and the approaching riders smaller still, like a smear on a clean plate. Even so, the sound grew, and the dust climbed, and the line of figures took shape. And a hand drifted to the worn grip of an iron tool that had names in other mouths. There was no need to speak. The plan had been made. It was a simple plan because simple plans break less when fear arrives. Days earlier, the town had been quiet in the way that means nobody trusts the air. Doors closed before boots reached porches. Voices dropped when strangers passed. At the far end of the main road stood a small office where a badge hung on a nail and a coat on another, and beside the door, a chair leaned back with grooves worn in the arms by someone who had done too much waiting. Inside, a man with tired eyes had studied maps and lists in the bottom of a cup. He knew what rode in from the hills every few weeks, and he knew what it took when it came. He had told himself that he would not watch it happen again. He had told himself that before. The stranger had come on a plain horse and under a plain hat. No one learned a name and no one pressed for it after the stranger spoke little and helped much. The stranger took a shovel when a storm washout cut the road. The stranger shouldered a sack of feed for a widow whose hands shook in the mornings. The stranger bought coffee for the badge and asked questions with care. And when answers came, they were the kind that make a back straighten, as if a weight had been shifted to a different set of bones. A gang came down from the ridges to collect coin and grain and fear. A gang came down to teach a habit. A habit had grown strong. The widow kept a small place beyond the last corral. The house had one good room and a lean-to, and the yard held a trough, a clothesline, and a sled for hauling firewood. The widow moved with the patience of someone who had learned to count breaths between pains. She did not speak much of the one who had gone, and when the stranger said that the ridges were growing bold, she did not look away or down. She asked what could be done that would keep children from seeing the inside of a sack. The stranger said there was a thing that could be tried if the town would try with it. The widow nodded, and there was a place at the table and a lantern on the hook, and plans that grew like knots in rope. By night, the stranger walked the main road with the badge and showed where shadows pool and where light betrays. And by day, the stranger taught hands to tie quiet knots and to pull wire with gloves on and to lay brush so that boot prints vanish. The blacksmith poured sand into a bucket to louden the swing of a door. The stable hand smeared grease on a hinge to quiet another. The grocer lifted trapdoors to show the dark under his floor and found space for a dozen souls. The old tracker spoke of wind and sage, and how smoke tattles on fools. The teacher measured lines on slate, and explained how many heartbeats fit between a lantern set on a sill and a rider reaching the porch. In the church, the bell rope was unknotted and retied so it could be dropped and lock the clapper silent. Small things, many small things. A town is a net if each knot holds, not all knots held. There was a man who stood at the edge of gatherings and let fear move his mouth at night. He spoke to faces that did not light lamps. He spoke of how the ridges took what they wanted, and how the wind always bent grass one way. He said that standing up was a story people tell each other when they want to feel tall before they lie down. He said the Ridges had long guns and quick hands and no need to sleep. He was not wrong about guns and hands. He was wrong about sleep. He was wrong about what tired people can do when they run out of floor to back onto. The stranger walked the widow's fence line and knelt where earth rose in a thin lip. Under that lip, the stranger drove stakes of scrap wood and wire. The stranger paced the yard and paced again, and measured with the length of a shadow and the width of a boot. In the barn, the stranger asked for a coiled rope and a grain scoop and a spilled bucket of nails. At the creek, the stranger tied driftwood into bundles and hid them under grass. None of it looked like much. It never does. A wall can be a line of weeds if you know how men ride. The badge came one evening with hands that could not find pockets and asked a quiet question. The stranger answered it by standing silent until the badge turned away. There is a certain kind of silence that agrees to carry part of a load. The badge did not smile, but the badge folded a map and put it under the shirt and walked with a different weight. People who had stopped trusting the air began to trust a plan made of small things. They trusted because they had nothing else to put weight on. They trusted because they saw a widow dust off a second chair for a stranger, and neither of them looked at the door while they spoke. On the last night before the dust rose on the flats, the children were put to bed early and told a plain story about dark that was not hungry, and light that would come back, and a garden that would need watering tomorrow. The widow checked the tin box with the ribbon and the letter, and the little iron tool wrapped in cloth. The stranger oiled a hinge, laid a coil of rope by the well, and set the kettle where it could be knocked over with a foot if fire reached the porch. The badge moved like a shadow from one doorway to another, and placed small white stones in the cracks of windowsills to see if hands moved them. An old hand at the livery set a lantern on the ground behind a barrel so the glow would lean in a certain way and tell a certain truth when horses ran. The night held, and the stars looked like nails holding up a roof. Dawn broke with sound, hooves in rhythm, voices flattened by distance, spurs ringing or maybe wire clinking. Dust turned the sky a sickly white. The stranger stood by the fence and watched the line bend toward the homestead. The homestead was a throat to be cut before the town could find a voice. That was the plan from the Ridges. Take the hard one first and the rest come easy. They always do, except when they do not. When the riders came within hail, one rode ahead and lifted a hand. The stranger did not lift one back. The rider called across the width of a field with words about safety and about leaving doors open so wind could pass, and about how storms are not made by men or answered by men. The words were lies that had once been true. The stranger did not answer. The rider laughed. The line split left and right like a snake tasting air. The stranger stepped back once, and as boots hit the yard, a plank under dry soil tipped, and a snare caught the first pair of legs and dragged its owner into a trough. The shout told the others where not to step. Then the ground took a breath and spat up noise as cans filled with rocks and bits of metal struck boards and made the sound of many more hands than one could count. A few riders pulled up. A few did not. Those who did not learned what wire can do to a rushing horse. The first pass took nothing and gave away much. It gave away who was rash and who listened to the rider who laughed. It gave away which saddles held long guns and which backs had knives. It gave away the way the leader lifted a hand that meant spread, and the way the next wave came low and fast, aiming for the flanks of a house that had no flanks to speak of. The stranger moved from fence to porch to corner and made each step count. The kettle in the kitchen began to sing, and the widow, who had not left, took it off the boil and set it on the floor, where steam could dampen the boards and keep a spark from walking. The widow counted too. Counting is a kind of prayer when there is no time for any other. The gang shifted tactics. Smoke sticks arced and landed in the yard. Two rolled under a bench. One hit the wall and fell still. The widow nudged the boiling kettle with a heel, and steam met smoke, and turned it into something that crawled close to the ground and bit the eyes. The stranger waited for the shape of a rider to blur and then moved. No speeches were given. No promises were traded. Things were done or not done, and where hands were steady, those things landed. A whistle sounded from the far fence, thin and high. At that sound, the line of riders on the left backed off and a small group sprinted for the barn. The old hand at the livery had been waiting for that. A rope slipped loose and a gate swung, and a pen full of nervous animals burst into the yard, scattering men, and knocking one into a stack of timber that shifted and fell, and made a wall where there had been a path. The animals ran blind and found the open space the stranger had left for them, and thundered across the flats toward open country. Hooves beat a new rhythm, and dust rose to hide everything from everything else. In that fog of earth, the stranger moved like a thought, toward the one who laughed. The leader rode a tall horse and sat like a man whose weight does not fall on stirrups because his balance lives somewhere else. He wore a coat made for cities and a hat that had never met rain. He watched with still eyes and gave few orders. Men like that are hard to reach because they do not ride where wire waits. They hang back and wait for others to pry doors. The stranger did not go to the door. The stranger went to the quiet place under the cottonwood, where sand holds tracks like a ledger. There, a set of boot prints told a story about someone who had circled wide in the night to see whether ladders leaned against eaves, that someone now watched from the gully. The stranger slid into that gully, and the ground swallowed the sound. When two figures met in that crease in the land, the first move was not iron, it was memory. The one in the gully knew the way the stranger walked, not by name but by the weight of each step and by the tilt of head when listening. A slow anger lifted in that face and became a smile without warmth. There were words about old work and old promises about how a hand that leaves is a hand that can be guided back, about how the hills keep a ledger in which every mark can be rubbed out by a line of fresh chalk. The stranger listened and said nothing. Then the stranger moved, and the ledger took a new mark that would not rub out. While the gully settled and the flats roared, the town woke. The bell did not ring, which meant the message had landed in the night. Doors opened onto alleys, not onto the main road. A line of small wagons rolled from behind the mill and curved wide across the back fields, taking the long way to the homestead because the short way was a mouth with teeth in it. On each wagon stood two figures with sacks of sand to steady them, and old rifles that had not been fired since a season of hunger. The badge rode at the side, not in front, because the badge had learned finally that being seen first is a story that ends one way. At the homestead, the riders had regrouped and were making a third pass, slower and meaner now. They set posts for cover and crawled in pairs, and this time they did not try for the door. They tried for the root of the house. They tried to sink it by pulling away the earth and letting the corner drop. That kind of work is ugly and slow, and it makes a sound like a groan. The widow heard it and felt rage rise like heat from a stove. But the widow did not move wild. The widow took the small iron wrapped in cloth, breathed on it like one breath can bless a thing, and set it near the hole where hands clawed. A moment later, there was no more clawing at that corner. The house settled back into the ground, as if deciding it would not be moved today. The leader watched and made a new plan. The new plan was simple. Fire makes the careful small things of a town and a home into ash that does not remember what shape it was. Torches were lit and passed hand to hand. The stranger saw that and felt a weight in the ribs that came from a room many seasons ago where another set of small hands had hidden behind a curtain while men shouted about rules. The stranger stood, and for a moment the world narrowed to the path between fire and dry boards. Then a new sound entered the yard, a low rumble like thunder too far to see. The wagons. They came from the side, not from the road the riders expected. They came over a low rise, wheels wrapped in strips of cloth to keep them from singing. And they came with a line of figures on foot between them, each carrying a shovel and a bucket. The old tracker had chosen that approach because wind rode from that side and would carry dust into the eyes of anyone looking up. The badge raised a hand, and the line broke like a wave around rocks, each person heading to a place chosen the night before. The grocer to the wall with the loose board where a barrel of water waited. The blacksmith to the corner with the beam that had needed bracing for months. The teacher to the pen where animals had been until minutes ago, to close a gate that would keep the yard from being a straight shot. The stranger felt something open in the chest that had been shut for a long time. It was not hope. It was the knowledge that hope had company. The first torch flew and fell short, hissing in wet dirt. The second landed on the porch and sputtered on damp boards. The third found dry straw in a corner by the coop and flame rose. The widow had been waiting for that spot. A rug soaked the night before slid over the straw and smothered the light. The badge fired once, not to hit, but to cut a line between two figures and make them move back without being told. The wagons rolled in a slow curve that pulled the rider's attention in 3 directions at once. One wagon tipped on a rut and spilled a crate of tools. The stranger ran to it and kicked the crate into a gap at the fence where a rider had meant to push through. The rider hit the crate and fell. The horse jumped over and kept going toward the open fields and freedom that belonged to anything with sense. In the gully, the second figure crawled backward and left a trail that looked like a red string laid on the sand. The stranger did not follow. The stranger climbed out on the homestead side and took position where the fence turned a corner. That corner had been braced with a bundle of driftwood from the creek. Now the bundle was cut loose and rolled, and with it went a tangle of wire and brush that lay unseen in grass. The tangle spread like a net and took 3 riders in one slow, hungry bite. They cursed and pulled and made things worse as wire bit into leather and flesh. The leader watched and did not ride to help. The leader rode to the side again and waited for a clean shot that never came. The battle turned from roar to grind. When dust fell, there were shapes on the ground and shapes propped against walls and a few figures who had run out of anger and could not find more. The sun climbed and made the world cruel and bright. Heat shimmered above the flats. The stranger drank a mouthful of water and held the rest in the mouth for a count of 5 and then let it go to keep the tongue from sticking. The widow checked the dugout and spoke soft to the little ones and promised bread with honey later, which was a kind of oath that can keep people alive even when honey is only a memory in a jar. The leader made one last play. A small group broke from cover and rode straight at the wagons, not to break them but to draw them away from the house. It worked for a breath. The badge wheeled to cut them off and the line of shovel carriers moved to block. In that opening, the leader charged the porch with 2 riders close behind. The stranger was there because the stranger had been waiting for that choice since the first hoofbeat. Iron spoke. Wood splintered. The first rider fell and slid and hit the steps. The second went over the rail and vanished into a flower bed that had been watered extra the night before so the soil would be soft. The leader reached the bottom stair and stepped off the horse and climbed like a man walking up a hill he meant to own. For a long moment the yard shrank to 2 figures and a line between them. The leader drew a long blade, not the tool most men of these hills favor, and moved with a grace that came from rooms with mirrors. The stranger moved with a grace that came from sleeping on dirt. Blows were traded. Not many. Each landed like a stamp on a ledger. The leader smiled once when a cut opened on the stranger's arm. The stranger did not smile when a cut opened on the leader's cheek. Then the blade caught in a part of the porch rail that had been cut and weakened the night before for just such a catch. And in that blink the stranger stepped in and ended it. Silence fell in ragged pieces, as if the wind had to pick them up and put them down. Somewhere a child cried once and then stopped, remembering a promise of honey. The badge stood with hands on knees and breathed like a bellows. The blacksmith sat on a step and laughed a little without humor because laughing is sometimes how a body lets go of what it cannot hold. The old tracker tied a strip of cloth around a leg without waiting to be asked. The grocer poured water into tin cups and made sure the first went to the widow and the second to the stranger, and the third to a boy who had stood in a doorway holding a broom as if it were a spear. The sun moved on, and the flats went quiet the way plains do after thunder. Men from the ridges who still had breath crawled away or were walked away, depending on whether they could see straight. The leader lay very still. The stranger turned the face to the sky and closed the eyes with 2 fingers and said a word that belonged to another life. The badge watched that and understood a piece of something that would take a long time to understand in full. In the afternoon, the town came as a body, not as many. Together they lifted and carried, patched and poured, gathered and marked. They made a line of small stones to show where each had fallen, because counting matters after as much as before. They carried water down to the dugout and out again. They fixed the door that had been knocked off its hinges and put the rug back in place and beat the dust out of it. They righted the tipped wagon and put the tools back in the crate. They spoke softly and did not say fine words. Fine words blow away. Hands stay. At dusk, the sky turned the color of old copper, and the first star showed where the day had a seam. The stranger stood by the fence line again and looked out at the flats and did not count. The widow came and stood at the other post and rested a hand on rough wood. No one asked the stranger to stay. No one asked the stranger to go. Both would have been too much to carry. The badge brought a small parcel wrapped in cloth and put it on the fence. Inside were coins and a length of clean bandage and a biscuit still warm. The badge said that this was not pay. The badge said that the town had decided to stop paying the wrong people. The stranger nodded once and did not unwrap the parcel. Night came like a blanket laid over a child who has cried and now sleeps heavy. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called and another answered. The stranger saddled the plain horse and checked the cinch, and looked once at the house with the porch and the watered earth and the flower bed where smell still rose. The widow stood in the doorway with a lamp turned low and did not raise it. Raising it would have made the leaving a show. The stranger touched the brim of a plain hat and rode toward the low wash where the creek cut the flats and where a person could leave without being counted by anyone who still liked to count. The road was not a road so much as a habit of the land. It curved where rock wanted and lifted where roots knit the soil and sank where animals had chosen the easier line for 100 years. The stranger followed its sense and let the horse choose its own thoughts. Behind, the town settled into a quiet that felt new. Doors stayed open a little longer. The bell rope hung loose, not knotted for silence. A chair beside a door held a coat and a badge, and the grooves in the arms felt shallow under the hands of someone who had decided to stop waiting and start walking when walking was needed. In the days that followed, a rider came down from the hills under a white cloth and carried a list written by a hand that shook. The list said that the ridges would not come down to take any more. It said that a ledger had been closed for now. It said that sometimes a habit breaks when it hits a wall that looks small and turns out to be made of many hands. The badge took that list and tacked it to the post where notices went, not to show triumph, but to show that words can do work when backed by things done. The widow planted beans near the corner that had tried to sink and found that the soil there held water better than it had before. The children played a game with stones that involved making lines and then stepping over them and then erasing them. The grocer swept his porch and left the broom leaning by the door. The blacksmith oiled hinges as if iron could learn from days of fire and decide to move without complaint. As for the stranger, the flat swallowed the shape and left no trace but a line of small half-moons in sand that the wind smoothed by noon. Stories about what came to pass traveled farther than any horse. Some said a gunfighter had found a heart and left it there. Some said a ghost had ridden out to settle an old score and had gone back to the place where ghosts live once the ledger balanced. Some said a town had looked in a cracked mirror and seen a face worth keeping. The truth was simpler. People had stood where they lived and made it harder to be pushed. They had practiced together until the ground itself felt different under their feet. When the first rain of the season finally came, it came hard and fast, and the water found every furrow and notch and carried away dust that had held the shape of fear. It left the boards of the porch darker and the fence posts cleaner, and the air sweet with the smell of sage. The widow stood in that rain and lifted her face and did not hide from it. The children ran and laughed and slipped in mud and shouted at a sky that shouted back. The badge walked hatless down the main road and let the rain wash powder from hair and worry from brow. The bell rang once, not as an alarm, but because someone had pulled it out of habit and then laughed at the sound. Evening fell on a town that would not call itself brave because brave is a word others use. It fell on hands that were sore and shoulders that were tired in the good way, and on a fence where a parcel had once rested and left a dry mark on the rail. It fell on quiet promises made without words, to look out for one another, to count hoofbeats early, to set water where fire might fall, to add small knots to the net every day because nets do not hold without tending. It fell on a wide land that had watched people come and go for longer than people can remember. And that land held their steps with the same old patience and the same old iron forgiveness. Far off, under stars, a campfire burned small and steady, and by its light a figure wound a strip of clean cloth around an arm and tied the knot with a care that belonged to people who do not take anything for granted. The figure ate the biscuit last, as if saving something good might guard against the next lean day. The horse cropped grass and lifted its head now and then to listen to a wind that no longer smelled like iron. In the morning, the figure would ride toward a line of low hills that looked like the backs of sleeping animals. Beyond those hills would be another town, and in that town another porch with boards that could catch a blade, and another fence that might learn to hold, and other small hands that needed promises kept. The figure did not think about names. Names break. Work endures. The night pulled its blanket close. The fire went to coals. Somewhere a rain line walked across the plains, erasing tracks and washing the salt from the face of a world that has seen too much of everything and still finds room for one more day. In a small house under that wide sky, a child slept with a ribbon in one hand and a tin box under the bed, and a woman with tired hands dreamed of a field of tall grass that bent not to men on horses but to a wind that was clean and full of light. And miles away, a rider woke before dawn, listened to a land that no longer held the sound of a pack, and decided for another day to ride toward places where counting still mattered.